welcome to another video. Today it's part 1 of the Vogue 8577 sew along. So for this sew along we are doing the Vogue 8577 pattern, and I've made this twice for myself now and twice for other people, for customers. And that's how I found out about this pattern, was from a customer, and from the line art it was kind of like, that's okay. The actual dress in real life is stunning and I love it, and I do have at least another 2 planned. I'm going to be making view B. This sew along will work for view B and view A. It will also work if you want to put the collar on, but if you want to put the sleeves on you will need to follow the pattern instructions as they are listed. This is a very fabric hungry dress. I have 5 meters of fabric and I have 5 meters of lining. Now I didn't use all of the fabric because I cut this out on a single layer, which is a much more economical way of cutting out fabric, but I would prefer to err on the side of caution and get the recommended amount that the pattern says. Because when I was cutting out for a previous customer, she only had 5 meters and we had to compromise on a few pieces, which meant that I also had to sew the pockets shut because I couldn't get the pocket skirt fronts completely cut out of her fashion fabric. So yes, it is fabric hungry, but it's definitely worth it once it's finished. You will end up with some great size scraps as well, which will work really well for pocket linings for coats, pocket linings for jeans perhaps. I have enough left that I'm going to send off some to get belt made by Harlequin Belts. I'll put their details in the description bar down below. I am planning on making a view C. When I do, I'll video the process and I will add it on to this sew alongs playlist. So there is a view C coming, but at the moment I am making view B, or view A and view B will work for this sew along. Today we're going to be talking about the supplies you're going to need, how to find your size from the pattern, envelope and tissue paper, tracing out your pattern and cutting out your fabric. So let's get started.
Okay, lovely peeps, you are going to need your pattern, your lining fabric, your main fabric. I'm doing view B, so I need at least 5.1 meters, although I only have 5, so we're going to make it work. Bias binding. This is if you want to follow along with exactly how I do it. It doesn't really matter the width of bias binding that you get, but I do suggest you get the satin finish ones, not the cotton finish ones, because the cotton finish ones tend to be a little bit too stiff. You'll need pins, fabric scissors. For the way I'm going to finish it, you're going to need pinking shears, but you can French seam, you can use your overlocker, there are lots of different options, but for me it's going to be pinked edges. You'll obviously need your sewing machine. You're also going to need some lightweight fusible interfacing. This is a generic one that I got from my local fabric shop, but the lightest weight you can get, the better. And tracing paper. You're also going to need buttons. It says you need 10 half-inch buttons. I'm going to use these because they are so cute and they work really well, and I love shell. I have way more than 10 there because I bought whatever was left from the shop. You may want to have more than 10. Mum used more than 10 for her skirt pieces because that's just, she preferred to have it buttoned up further. But yes. Don't forget your buttons. So I'm going to be making view B, and I am going to be doing it with the pockets. Now if you decide that you want to make view B but you don't like the pockets, which is what Mum decided, you can use the front lining piece to cut out your main fabric and then just omit the pocket bands, the pocket facing and the skirt side fronts here. So you literally won't have to cut any of those out. You will just have to cut the skirt front lining out of your lining fabric and your main fabric if you don't want the pockets. Personally, I love the pockets, so I am including them. So the first thing that I'm going to do is iron everything. I'm going to iron my pattern pieces so they lie flat. I'm going to iron my main fabric and my lining. Okay, so I've already traced out and cut out my pattern, so I'm not going to be doing that again. But whilst I was doing this one, which is actually for another customer, I thought I'd film this little bit just to show you. So you do want to go by your measurements when buying patterns, not your ready-to-wear high street size. So these sizes here have no correspondence to high street sizing. then the person that I'm actually making this for has a 35-inch bust, so the 14 would be best, and a 30.5-inch waist, so the 16 would be best according to the pattern envelope. What you want to do though is you want to check your pattern pieces for the actual finished garment size, because here, as you can see, the size 14 has a 30.5 finished 30.5 inches finished measurement. Now that means my customer is technically between sizes, but what I'm going to do is I am going to do her a size 12 top and a size 14 waist, and I'm going to adjust the seam allowance to allow that extra little bit of room for her, because there is plenty of seams around the middle part that I can do that with. So what I've done, I've already traced this out, and I basically just take my French curve and I place it up against that line, and I try to get the best fit in one sweep, and then so it's a 10 at the top. So I then move the 10 over to the top of the 12, and I literally trace it like that, and then put in the notches there. And that's just how I trace between sizes when I need to trace different sizes for different pattern pieces. That means that all of the skirt pieces will be traced as a size 14, and all of the bodice pieces will be traced as a size 12. Also, when you're tracing, don't forget to add the line. You don't have to draw the dots, but just draw the line through these dots as well as this line, because that will help you piece these pieces together. It's 7 and 7A because they are too big for the pattern company to put on one tissue paper, so you have to trace them and then stick them together. There's a couple of other pieces like that, like 12 as well. One more note for when you're tracing out, this is the front facing piece, and as you can see it has a very blunt top here. For the way that I am going to finish my front facing piece, what you actually want to do is take your front bodice piece and you want to continue this up so that it becomes a point. I'll show you when I've traced it out, but yeah, either that or you want to take the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance off of this, but I personally would recommend that you extend your pattern piece, and I'll show you how in a second. Okay, so as you can see I've traced around the pattern piece, but I have left off that line there and I've extended this front line all the way up. Now what I'm going to do is put the front bodice piece, which is just here, underneath, and I'm going to get the line that I need for this piece from that. Okay, so I have the pattern piece went to there, and I've just added on this extra bit there. You don't need to go all the way up to the top, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that this is less than 5/8 of an inch, because I'm going to be using bias binding on this edge, which means that I'm not going to be folding the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance under. So I just need to come up so that I'm into less than 5/8 of an inch here, so that it will all get caught and hidden inside of the seam allowance, and you'll see that when I am making the dress later. Now there are also lengthen and shorten lines on this pattern on the waist pieces, and you need to remember, if you have lengthened or shortened your waist pieces, you will need to adjust your front plackets accordingly. And there are there any? No, there are no shorten or lengthen or shorten adjusting lines on the pattern for the actual pattern piece itself to remind you to do that. So if you have lengthened your bodice or shortened your bodice, you must remember to do the same thing to your placket, even though the pattern piece does not tell you to do that. Okay, so I'm cutting out my lining pieces first because my fabric is directional and I'm not going to be able to cut it on the fold as I can with this, because otherwise I'll have half of the birds on the skirts and the bodice upside down and half of them the right way up. So I'm going to have to cut them out as single pieces. So I am cutting out the lining pieces first, and so I'm going to mark them all, and then I'm going to unpin them. I'm going to use those as my pattern pieces to cut out for the single layer of fabric, because that way I'll be able to place everything correctly. Now my cutting table isn't quite wide enough, but I'm kind of, you know, I've had to kind of make do with that. And the way that I folded this fabric is, rather than selvage to selvage, I have folded it in half along the length so that the selvages meet at this side. So there is a fold there, which is what that skirt piece is on. I'm going to pin all the biggest pieces on first. I'm then going to adult Tetris in the rest of the pieces, get those cut out, and as I say, use them as pattern pieces to cut out my main fabric, which is over there. Quick note, the skirt front lining is a different pattern piece to the skirt front. There are two separate ones. This is, the lining is 13, pattern piece 13, and then the actual one that you want to cut out of the fabric is pattern piece 7, and they differ because this one has the notch for the pocket. Okay, so the lining pieces are all cut out, and I'm now going to mark them all with all of the notches and any other details that I need to mark, which will make construction easier. Because I'm using white cotton lawn, which obviously doesn't have a side, I am going to mark on these the name of the pattern piece, and then I'm going to pin it to the right side of it so that I cut pairs, not symmetrical pieces, because that would be bad doing that out of the main fabric. And I'm also going to use my friction pen and my French curve to put in the dart lines and any gather points that I need. Friction pens come away with heat. They do leave a residue. You need to check with your fabric, on your fabric first on a scrap, to make sure that you are happy with what is left once you've applied heat to it. For me, it's fine. For the cotton lawns, there are some fabrics that I've used, however, that it has left a really obvious line, and these can also come back when they get too cold, which is another thing to bear in mind. But my dress is washable and will be washed, which will get rid of this as well. This is the back of the skirt, and it's the bit that needs to be gathered, so I need to mark the gather points on both sides. And also, I personally have just made a tiny little notch in the centre back, so that it just helps when finding and placing it when I'm making the dress, because I'm also there's a centre back seam that I will match that up to. It just helps. That's how I like to do it. So this is a really good example. This is the bodice front. I have marked in the dart with my friction pen. You don't need to press hard, just so that you can get the line that you need to follow for stitching. I've got my 2 gather points marked up there, and then I have put bodice front on the actual, what is going to be the wrong side of these, but as long as I have a matching pair, not identical pieces, that is what I need for cutting out the main fabric. The lining pieces are all cut and labelled. Now I need to cut out the main fabric, and I have, that's the skirt band, that's the facing, and that is the skirt front that I didn't need to cut out of lining. So cutting out on a single layer is actually much more economical than cutting out on a folded layer, because you can really play around with piece placement and pattern placement as well. Now the thing that I was worried about with these middle pieces is that I was going to get them upside down, so I have made sure that obviously when I put the label on, that I put the label on with the writing facing the right way up. As you can see, the bird's that way, so this is the top, this is the bottom, which means that that's going to be the right way up. Now with the back pieces, I am going to avoid getting any birds on. I'm just going for leaves, which gives me a fighting chance of it not looking too busy and disorientating because of this large print, and because there is a lot of seam lines. The other thing that you need to remember when you're cutting out like this is that you're not going to have marked your grain line on your lining pieces. So get your pattern piece out and then make sure that you are in line with the grain. This one is not, it needs to come over a little bit more. That, looking at it in real life it's perfect. On the camera it might look a little bit squishy, but that's squiffy because I'm holding the camera funny possibly. But yeah, check your grain line with your pattern pieces like this before you pin. Okay, so after all the pinning out, the only pieces that I have left to cut is another one of those, another pocket front panel, and then 3 more pocket bands. But look at all that fabric. I have more than enough to do that. So, oh, I've also got to cut out the facings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out all of this stuff now, and then I'm going to cut another one of those on the reverse. I'm going to double it up and cut the facings out. And I'm going to, there's lots of bits and pieces, like for example, here, I've got a large portion of fabric there, so that's where I'm going to get the other pocket facing and things out of. So yeah, very economical to cut out this way, just much more time consuming. I have my front facing pieces here ready to cut out, and as you can see I have lengthened them by 1 inch because I have lengthened my bodice by 1 inch. And you need to remember to do that. I know I've said it before, but you need to remember to do that. The other thing that I would say is, because I'm going to hem mine differently to how the pattern recommends, I am actually going to cut probably sort of another good 5 inches of length on my facings, just so that I have wiggle room, because the last thing that I want is to have to recut these, because although I ended up with a really decent size amount of fabric and I could recut them, it's a pain in the proverbial, especially if you've interfaced them and everything. So yeah, I would recommend that you cut your facing pieces probably about 5-6 inches longer than the pattern piece, just so you have wiggle room for when you come to hem. The final piece of cutting out that we need to do is the lightweight interfacing, and you're going to want to cut out 2 of your pocket bands and 2 facing pieces for your dress.
So if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!